hi, folks. My name is Matt Bawol. I'm the Director of Platform Architecture and Engineering for EVOTEK. I am here today to talk to you guys really about modern remote access patterns and some of the security challenges with them. Joining me today is Georgi, who is a field CTO for Palo Alto Networks, specifically focused on their Prisma Access product. And so hopefully we're going to have a really good conversation today and talk a little bit about this space. So I wanted to start just talking about where, kind of the idea of where we were at some of the more pivotal moments that we've had in the last couple of years. I don't know about everyone else, but for me, there are certain moments that are kind of flashpoints in my life, right? 9/11, when my children were born. And one of them that occurred in early 2020 was that moment in January where I realized that I was going to have 300,000 employees that I was responsible for moving home to do work because we were going to have to shut all our offices down due to COVID. I was working for GE as a principal security architect, focused on, amongst other things, our network practice. And so as a consequence of that, as the situation emerged, I was one of the folks who was tapped directly with the daunting task of figuring out both how we were going to scale our infrastructure, but also how we were going to maintain our security posture as we did that. And as you can imagine, like most companies, we weren't very prepared. We were prepared for, I guess I'd say, secure remote access for the use cases that we had supported. But as we started moving everyone to home, as I said, 300,000 employees and various contractors, we found that there was an almost innumerable field of use cases we had to look at and change the way we conceptualized remote access to the organization. Jason, if you don't mind, just skipping the next slide.
Sure.
So the way I think about this is really that the story is one of what happens when we lose buildings as a construct in the overall framework of how we establish security controls. Buildings are great, right? They provide you an opportunity to employ physical security. You can monitor people via cameras. You can install access management tools. You can detect whether somebody has walked into your building that isn't, expected to be there via, alarming and various other mechanisms. Maybe you've even got a fancy man trap and, really can scrutinize people as they walk in the door. Obviously, once you lose the building, you lose that capability, which is the foundational capability for a lot of third-party relationships at large companies, right? You've got a call center that's in India. A lot of the story of how we provide, security controls that stand up to regulatory scrutiny when we're talking about an office like that really is founded on that idea of active monitoring of people. So when we lose the building, we lose all of that capability. And, there's really not a very good way to substitute for it. So we kind of have to pivot our thinking away from that idea of physical security as an overall category that we can employ. Secondly, we lose a lot of our capabilities with regards to the basics of network security, right? So if I'm working in a mature environment, hopefully I have some form of network access control deployed. I know what devices are being connected. I can monitor those. I can identify the what of a thing on the basis of what port it's plugged into and what it's doing, what its MAC address is. That allows me to do things like differentiate some things for the building itself, because I've created in a sense of entitlement by virtue of the fact that you've successfully connected to that local network. Well, now I can reasonably trust that you should be allowed to go to some other areas of our network space, and we can derive some forms of segmentation from that same assumption. We can say, okay, well, you're on my GE network, therefore I'll let you access some of these restricted resources within the US domestic. Or maybe for going back to that site in India, in order to maintain the sovereignty bounds, maybe we don't allow you to access some of those US domestic resources to prevent exfiltration of data, incidental or conscious. So again, by losing the building, we lose that capability to do those kind of gross grain differentiations. And, that obviously undercuts really a lot of the basics of how people establish a perimeter, at least in terms of how they used to establish perimeter in like an old school way of thinking about this sort of problem. Another thing that we lose is resiliency, right? Like, so if you have a business continuity plan that involves moving from one office to the other, and suddenly, and rather than that, you're dealing with, 15,000 different internet connections just for your business unit across the globe as the source of potential disruption, that's a big concern, right? Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, if the local ISP is down or the gateway is down, you suddenly lose the ability for people to do their functional day-to-day jobs. And that's just the reality of the shift away from, again, a building. The last thing, which I found to be kind of daunting, it's actually probably the area where I spent the most time directly learning during the course of COVID, is around regulatory compliance. Not that I don't know a lot about regulatory compliance, but I have to say I got very deep specifically on Indian telecommunications laws in a way that I never anticipated. Largely, and I don't want to lecture on this. That's probably a whole nother subject because they're quite, I guess I'd say, broad. But if you're dealing with many other foreign sovereign entities, not just India, I'm picking on them largely because of this particular story I'm telling. You find that the actual regulatory requirements may really require people to be in buildings. There's a whole definition around the sorts of entities that are allowed to integrate with ISPs in India. And essentially, you must tie, especially if you're doing call center functions, you must tie a physical location to those ISPs, and all access must be brokered that way. I think it's really probably a play to avoid offshoring from India to yet other places. So all of these things created huge challenges that really were introduced to us, and I think pushed to the fore by COVID. Honestly, the COVID response, I think, for most companies was extremely reactive. We didn't have time to plan for things because we were suddenly dealing with an unprecedented event. A lot of the things that we ended up discussing as potential outcomes were things that had been discussed more abstractly in the industry, but it was usually kind of that, let's push this off to the future. Zero trust networks, right? Like, at the end of the day, everyone's been talking about that in the industry for perhaps 10 to 15 years, but we didn't have to take it seriously as a global concept until, I think, COVID struck. Jason, could you move to the next slide, please? So for me, what this ends up translating to is that rather than a building, you end up with dealing with endpoints as islands, really like a site of one. You have a single person who's sitting in an individual location with a device and is attempting to access, restricted assets within your environment. You don't know anything about what the situation is, right? They could be sitting in a noisy environment like a coffee shop. They could be, so public. They could be sitting, in a well-structured office environment, like, hopefully most of you are today, where, there are relatively limited outside distractions, but you just don't know. You don't know who's shoulder surfing. There's really no way for you to establish that. So by thinking about these things as kind of this site of one, we have to kind of reconceptualize what matters from a security framework that I can apply that gives me some confidence that I can trust that asset to access an environment. So for me, that starts with posture assurance, looking at a device and understanding the who, what, and where of it, and what tools are deployed to it, and whether or not those tools are healthy. That's actually more daunting than you might expect. For your employees and for those where you control the device posture, pretty straightforward, right? Like, you probably know what what tools you're supposed to deploy. You probably know, okay, well, I'm actively monitoring this with a SOC. I know what the events and alerts are that are affiliated with that. But the minute you start to talk about third-party access, and let's not kid ourselves, third parties do need to have legitimate use cases to access your environment, this situation becomes much more complex. The proliferation of tools becomes much more evident, and it becomes much more difficult to establish what an effective posture is that you are controlling for, never mind actually auditing the device effectively on the other end. So posture insurance becomes part of the equation, but not really necessarily the entirety of the equation, even though in some ways it may be the simplest thing to lift, especially with traditional tools like your VPNs, right? Most VPNs will allow you to do a basic posture check, look for the presence of, what your EDR solution or whatever else you elect to choose. But at the end of the day, once you establish that that posture is good, you're connected to the network. There isn't usually active polling of that posture. And similarly, like there isn't necessarily a clear understanding of whether or not that posture has itself been spoofed, right? You can't necessarily go deep to understand whether or not those tools are working as expected with most common VPN tools. So we have to look a little bit deeper than that. And I think that the next thing that we have to think about really is how we establish, and I hate the phrase zero trust, but let's use it since it's the industry standard. We really have to establish what it means to secure a non-perimeter perimeter. And by that, I mean, we have an environment where theoretically you have arbitrary entities from arbitrary locations reaching in. So once you do that, this all becomes a story about an identity and individual entitlements, aligning, say the actual functional responsibility of a person and their role to the things that they can access within the environment. And if we can't get to that level of differentiated access, then it becomes very difficult to do more than just allow them gross-grained access, which in turn exposes us to extreme risks, right? We're always trying to strive for least privilege and security, but I think the push towards working from home has made us focus more on that as an overall topic. And I think, alongside that, I mentioned here step-up authentication. Just establishing what that entitlement is and what that posture is. You don't necessarily know what the situation is on the other end of a device. Once a device is connected, if it's in good health, it remains connected. So you don't know if it's been moved, stolen, compromised in some other way. So the idea of step-up authentication and essentially polling resources to make sure that the individual who's seeking administrative access on one of your servers actually does have the correct what and who to establish that they should have access in that very moment becomes important, right? Essentially, driving escalation of privileges as a component of establishing entitlements, I think becomes much more significant once you move to kind of a work from home environment and that kind of remote access. I think also, underscoring all of this, as the idea of being able to have effective data leak protection, particularly now that we have folks who are working outside of buildings as the most common use case, becomes very difficult to establish and maintain data sovereignty, right? There are innumerable laws, GDPR comes to mind, where crossing boundaries with data is a regulatory consequence. So we need to be really clear on what data people have that's available, where they are, and whether it's appropriate for them to be able to access that data from that remote location and from their own, consequential role. So I think that one of the biggest challenges there really is kind of, in some cases, retroactively figuring out what those data classifications are and figuring out how we are going to control for that in real time, again, where the endpoint itself may be a little bit of a moving target and a little bit less reliable. And last, I think we need to have good patterns for incident response that include the ability to immediately intercede. We need to be able to identify that if something has happened. We need to be able to immediately kill the session that is related to the device that has access to the asset that is potentially compromised. And I think by focusing on these areas and essentially reframing those in the context of the idea of the endpoint as the main initiator of control, with intervening technologies as the brokers of that control, we can start to reframe our overall defensive strategy in a way that defers a lot of the increased risk of working from home. The reality is, I think that we will, in some use cases, go back to the office, but we're going to have increasing pressures both from society and both from the realities of the ongoing pandemic to allow people to work arbitrarily from anywhere. We need to be able to respond to that effectively as security practitioners. And even though we're 2 years into this pandemic, I would argue that we still have opportunities to improve that posture. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jason, who is an extreme expert on this space, having worked both for Penn and for GE Networks, amongst others. So Jason, would you like to opine about some of these things?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Matt. Thank you. And thanks everybody for attending the session. I do appreciate it. Yeah, so as Matt stated, I am the field CTO for our SASE capability here at Palo Networks. And SASE, for those of you that don't know the acronym yet, you will be somewhat educated on it. It's not quite a deep dive on that specifically, but the use cases it solves specifically around the remote worker, right? So I'll jump into that. As he stated, I was a GE, part of this, the CTO network organization had a shared services team that I ran, and our responsibility was to be a service provider for the business units. And that included network and network security and certain telecom services. So my team's charter before I left GE, and this was going on, I guess, nearly 7 years ago now, was to partner with, Matt's team that he was in most recently to really figure out how to get our network and network security ready for cloud and mobility. So this was a driver that was already starting, a long time ago, for a lot of organizations. What the pandemic really just kind of did was push things forward very quickly, right? So we wound up seeing what amounts to years of change in just months, right? The behaviors, how we work, what we access, all of the stuff changed very rapidly. And there was a very reactive phase that we all had to go through. And now that I think we're finally coming out of the reactive and let's stabilize what we're doing moving forward. We're able to really assess what we need to think about, right? How are we defining access? How are we defining the user, right? Because I think that's changed and evolved over time. Just as Matt said, once you lose that physical security of a building, well, let's think about the network that our users are connecting to in order to access even our most critical resources. The first transit network, right outside of their home broadband network, that they're attaching to is the internet. And that's neither a private or controllable network. So how then do we ensure that we can control transit through it? So, reliability, scale, and all those things, while embedding security with it, because all of that physical and even device security, right? Authenticated access points, network access control, different things that we could do in the office is now gone. So security just has to be embedded in the connectivity. That's really what SASE, or a secure access service edge, is all about. And again, I will hit on that at a high level, but then really get into the remote worker use case and things like that as we go. So really what we faced, and what CIOs, and I think we have a few of you on this particular session, have faced over the last 2 years really was a change, right? And it was no more evident by how you got hit with what you need to solve for right now, right? It's a pivot from what we were doing, whether that was doing a lot of investing in cloud and digital experiences for customers. Now we had to shift and pivot towards enabling a remote workforce. But again, now we're out of that reactive phase. So now where are we going to invest to make sure that what we've done, we either course correct and do it better, right? So if we had to maybe up VPN capacity to get users over the hump, fine, we do what we have to do. But now that we've got the opportunity to reassess and rationalize what we're doing from an access perspective, what does that actually look like? Because it's not, and you'll see a couple of things in here, right, around customer experience, right? And that goes for our external customers as well. When your organizations, for those of you that, rely on retail or some type of service industry, had brick and mortar, right? Think about how much you had to have a digital presence to stay alive, right? So this was more around survival, not just a competitive advantage. And so with that, it's time to get back to a lot of those priorities and figure out how we keep the business resilient from things like this. Because as things tend to get better, then they get worse again. Now they might be getting better. I don't know. We'll see. But we just have to be ready, because none of us have a crystal ball. That's the bottom line. So how do we make what we're doing as resilient as possible for what we don't know? And so I like to ground every conversation I have with prospective customers or those that want to hear me talk around a few key principles. And there are a couple here that mean more than others, right? And the first one is right at the top. Work is an activity, not a place. So as Matt said, it's just kind of a way we look at things moving forward as stewards of security to say, how do we address things? Well, if we eliminate assumptions around, a physical presence that a user may be working from, or how they're going to attach to something, and we just say, it may not matter, right? Users anywhere, how they're going to connect anyhow, what do we do to solve that problem while maintaining a consistent security posture, whether the user happens to go on-prem sometimes or off? How do we make sure we handle that? Redefining the user is especially important when we think about they're not just human anymore. And even those that are human, they're not just employees, right? We've got contractors, third parties, joint ventures, all kinds of stuff. But in the overall redefinition of user, a user is anything that consumes one of our services. It could be an application, a device, an API, right? So when we think about user access and securing user access, we have to account for all of the vectors, not just one or two. Okay, speed and agility, new currencies, that gets into that digital experiences. How do we get better, keep a competitive advantage? Well, IT has a lot to do with that, and information security within an organization too. If we can make our estate more nimble and dynamic and flexible, we can pivot quickly, right? So as a business needs a pivot or we need to do something, we're right there with them, right? They're not waiting on us to do what we need to do in order to keep them secure while they want to do something different or adapt. Every company is a tech company, hands down. When we talk about end customer digital experiences, when we talk about big data analytics, just to keep the business intelligence going and things like that, we're using tech, right? And technology is no longer the domain strictly of IT. And so with the consumerization of it and things like shadow IT, just to be more productive, we just need to figure that out, right? That we need to understand that there are some very savvy people in the business side, and we just need to adapt to that and make sure that we're doing what we can to support them. Platforms, when we talk about how we enable what the business needs to do, that's going to extract the most value, right? Point product after point product, that's what we had to do because there was no such thing as a real platform until recently, at least when it came to network security. And so now that there are platforms that actually exist. Now, how can we invest in something that's going to solve a use case that we need to today, but then also grow with us as our needs evolve and move forward? When it comes to access, right? Matt hit on zero trust. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that. The foundation is identity, right? Identity-based access to something, right? How do we understand the context and validity of that particular user? Well, that's one really foundational element, but it's just not enough, right? When we think about Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and how credential theft happens and spoofing and all of those types of things, we need to account for more than that. Right? Identity-based access via policy by itself is setting you up for disaster in the future. Visibility and inspection are not the same. You need to keep that clear, right? Inspection around content. And when we're talking about application access and things like that, what is going on within that application session? Are we able to look for behavioral changes? Are we able to look for embedded threats and embedded unknown threats, right? So 0 days and things like that could be a way in, right? If somebody's exploiting me as a user, I'm attaching into something, and then all of a sudden I have access to something that is extremely critical. Malware plants itself there. Okay, sometime later, another critical user or a high-profile user accesses that resource. They've got it, or it detonates, and we create some type of east-west infection across our server segments. Things like that have got to change. We've just got to get better, and we can't rely on visibility alone. And then finally, the network, right? Matt and I are both, network security practitioners. You can't do security right without it. And that's a public or private network. By public, of course, meaning the internet, because there's always got to be a way to get you somewhere. So the network, no matter how you define that, has to be part of what we're solving for moving forward. So what you need to care about, really, if we had to sum it up into 3 key parts, as you look at what you want to do moving forward, or even how to assess things as you do, we should figure out control, prevention, and simplification, right? That's what's going to set us up for success the most. Controlling access, obviously preventing unauthorized access, that's a key tenet of zero trust for sure. But prevention, we should be preventing all we can. So as much inline security as we can do, content inspection and things like that. What we can't prevent for whatever reason, we need to be able to react to as quickly as possible. And then once we're able to react and we figure out how to do that, how can we orchestrate and automate a response, right? So we get better at this, because the human element can only do so much, right? We can only throw so many bodies at the problem. So automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that is how we're going to keep up. Because obviously, as we've seen, the threatscape is not smaller, it's growing and it's speeding up, right? The attacks are more prevalent than ever. And so the only way we're going to be able to do this is through some type of automation capability. And then again, simplification. This is about the platform again. The more simple we can deliver a capability strong enough to protect our users, no matter where they're working, accessing any resource that they're trying to access, the better we're going to be from a consistency perspective. That's what's important. We talk about policy consistency and things like that. Well, you can't do that when you've got disparate products all over the place, right? So a platform is what's going to actually give that to you and help set you up for greater success down the road. So secure access service edge, kind of again going to hit on this in a little bit at a higher level, is about convergence. And the original principle defined by Gartner, right, in August of 2019 was converging networking and security at the cloud edge in order to improve some of the things that we're talking about. Users working from anywhere, whether it's at home, in the branch, or on the go, accessing resources in the data center, cloud, SaaS, or web. So getting them connectivity and then getting them there securely. That's where it all started a couple of years ago. Where now I think things are evolving to, at least where we're pushing it, at Palo. So this is a general statement, but where I see this needing to go is that's a good start, right? Networking and security combination. Some debate the networking part of that a little bit, but as I stated, I think it's important to do security right. But then user experience. We think about how many now critical apps we're sending through remote access all of the time, right? Full-time remote workers, or most of the time remote workers. How are we getting that visibility back? How are the network operations teams getting visibility back into that full app or data delivery path, right? Because if something starts to break down and we have a service impacting incident, we need to identify it quickly, triage it, and remediate it to stop the spread of that impact, right? And to ensure that when we are pushing users at home or shifting workloads from the data center to cloud and SaaS, that we're able to provide as good of a user experience as we can, because we're trying not to compromise, right? We're trying not to provide greater security for the sake of a poor user experience, or here's this great user experience, but you have no security. This gets back to kind of how we had to deal with things initially, or some organizations where they wound up splitting VPN traffic, right? Where all right, data center traffic, go to the security place, but we just have too much trying to get there right now, split it off, send it to SaaS and whatever direct. We'll rely on some endpoint security, but we're losing visibility, right? And so how do we make sure we get that visibility back so we can not only scale to support all of the application access, but secure it all as well? And so a really comprehensive SASE should look something like this, right? Again, if work is an activity, not a place, we need to worry about the network, and whatever that means, public or private. But if we're using SD-WAN from a branch or whatever that happens to be, how do we then get them there securely, right? The security service layer, making sure that we have things like firewall delivered as a service, cloud access security broker for secure SaaS access, zero trust network access, whether that's just to the data center or cloud or all of the above. And then a secure web gateway, because over 70% of our business internet traffic is web-based. So we need to be able to secure that. So, these are the original 5 core capabilities that Gartner defined with their SASE, or Secure Access Service Edge, market release in August of 2019. It's gone on to expand a little bit. They've included some additional capabilities like sensitive data inspection and prevention of loss, line rate processing, and things like that. But then, and that's all well and good. But then again, what did I say before? Moving all of this stuff to a cloud delivered security capability, really great, really important, helps solve a lot of problems, but we need to have the insights, right? We need to get visibility back into that path. We can't just leave it up to chance, or we can't just leave it up to somebody else that we have no control over. Moving from private services to public changes the game. We just have to get that visibility if we have no direct control over where that traffic is flowing. Now, as this moves forward, right? So, I talk to, customers every day about Secure Access Service Edge, or the principle or concept of it. And a lot of the time it comes up, hey, what do we actually want to do with this? Do we want to bring our own, right? Do we want to build our own SASE in a way? Because we like this component over here. We like this ZTNA component. We like this secure web gateway. Why don't we buy them, stitch them together, and call it a SASE, right? But the idea that's counter to the idea, and this gets down to the whole concept I was talking about as well around. Sorry, skipped ahead accident, but it's around ensuring that we are delivering a consistent security policy. So if we could, so again, assume the user is anywhere and they're accessing any resource. If we could have that governed through one access policy, would that be easier on the organization? Sure, it would. It decreases management complexity. It decreases policy administration, change control, all of those things, skill set requirements, by solidifying that down. But then what about the security posture too? If you have a need to do inline DLP for data in motion, don't you want to be able to do data in motion across all of your traffic flows? Sure you do. Don't you want to be able to do then zero-day threat prevention, your sandbox, across all traffic flows? Because web security is fine, but think about attack vectors in any scenario, not just information security. But if you're an attacker, okay, and the last 10 years have been spent fortifying web security, including sandboxing, right? So sandboxing, looking at web and secure web traffic. Well, if you're an attacker, what's the path of least resistance? Well, it's certainly not web, right? So let's start looking at other vectors. So you need something that's going to be able to apply zero-day prevention, unknown threat prevention across any traffic type and across all traffic flows. Because once something gets in, or once a remote access client is disconnected and things are happening, especially in home networks, once they reconnect in, we have to get better about what we're doing in terms of prevention yet again. So, before I get in specifically to the remote worker access piece of this, what is SASE really trying to solve for? Well, it's really trying to solve for a couple of our key initiatives that we're looking at right now and the challenges with them. A hybrid workforce, right? Because not all of us are full-time remote. Some of us do have, a day in the office or 2 days in the office, half a day here, half a day there, whatever it is. But regardless, we're everywhere, right? It doesn't really matter is kind of the point. And so we need to make, the challenge that comes with that is, how do we have that consistency that when I am in the office or when I am traveling or when I am at home, nothing really changes as far as my posture, right? That the posture is maintained. When we do talk about moving into cloud and digital, right? And continued cloud adoption and migration, well, we don't want to compromise, like I said before, on user experience for security or vice versa. So how do we move to the cloud and improve security while ensuring the user experience is strong? And then the simplification, modernizing. I haven't spoken to a technology C-level in probably a year and a half that doesn't want to simplify, right? Like the estate has gotten out of control. There are plenty other domains of security that these guys can control. How do we get access, secure access, simplified into a more common denominator or platform, if you will? So then SASE is designed to directly address the remote worker, right? Zero trust network access is a key enabler of supporting that initiative. Branch transformation. So when you combine the network side with the security side, you can use next-gen SD-WAN services to optimize the path. Obviously, reduce MPLS costs, because now you can confidently move from MPLS to ISP connectivity, because maybe you're doing more application layer 7 based application steering. So the ability to control that traffic is a little bit better. So all of that helps with cloud migration, in terms of where the application sits today, good user experience to it. As it moves, maintain a good user experience while not having to hairpin everybody back to a data center for security controls. So SASE is a pillar, right? It supports these because it is optimizing the path. This is a cloud delivered security capability, so it's more in line between that user and the destination. The consistency of policy is assured, right? If everything is passing through that same data plane, you wind up having the same level of control over the security content that you would, regardless of where that happens to be working from. Improving the user experience is the key objective to why it's cloud delivered, right? We think about security placement, and back in the day when we did have that perimeter, right, where we had a hardware firewall, assets were in the data center, everything was protected from both internal threats and external threats. Perfect. Users are everywhere, data's anywhere, it's prolific. How do we make sure that we now get the right security, that full layer 7 security in the right place? And then obviously the simplification piece will come from the ability to simplify into consolidate into a common platform. So some of the things that we start, right? The hybrid workforce. As people are working everywhere, we want to ensure that we have the ability to provide that optimal path and security where we need it, right? Certain applications may be safe enough, or we have a higher risk tolerance for them, or there's a trusted means of establishing access in another way. Fine. But those applications that do need additional security inspection and threat prevention and things like that, we've got a security cloud that is upstream from that connectivity to ensure it's taking it all in and inspecting and applying policy. Now, the home worker and the on-the-go worker is where the importance of zero trust network access comes from. So let's look at that for a second. ZTNA. Traditional approaches aren't ZTNA, right? When we think about a traditional VPN and what are the things that we have to solve for when it comes to ZTNA, we need it to prevent implicit trust and access, right? We need something that is going to provide identity-based and least privileged access, adaptive access based on the user device condition, right? This is what Matt was talking about too, around posturing. You know, there should be many elements and steps around providing access. And the first should be in device interrogation. Is it where it's supposed to be? Does it have the right software revs? Does it have the right antivirus level or whatever EDR or XDR capability you have running on it? Is it up to snuff? You know, so what are the variables that you need to make sure are correct of that device before you even understand who the user is, right? Who's actually using the device. And then you talk about the user and who they are and validate them, right? Authentication status, again, location, based on what type of device they're on. You know, is my access different, right? If I'm on a company issued laptop versus an iPad or an iPhone, should my access be different? It absolutely should be. So depending on what these variables are between the device and the user, you can assess the risk. And once you've assessed the risk, you can then say, yep, user's good, or they're mostly good. Let's see what application they're trying to access. So it's kind of like a serial process, right? Device, user, application. Based on the condition that I understand of that user, am I giving them the access they're requesting to that application, or a scaled down version of access, or no access at all, right? So it's got to be based on those variables that we actually allow access to happen. Then great, that's what we do. And that's what the software-defined perimeter is really good at doing as well. That is the traditional, if you look at the zero trust network access vendor market, they're pretty much SDP based. The challenge with them is they don't all do session assessments, right? That's a key issue because they wind up building encrypted sessions between the user and the application or the application connector. So essentially they're hands off, right? The cloud becomes a broker rather than a security cloud. The ability, because of that encrypted session between the user and the application as well, it's impossible to do inline DLP, right? It's impossible to do inline threat and zero-day prevention. So when you have those things kind of going on, there's a level of zero trust initially, and then you have, you know, a problem, right? Which is trust then after via the session. So there's ways to you know, shore that up, and typically a firewall-based zero trust network access capability can do that because it's not operating as a software-defined perimeter. So it's still solving the tenants that we need to solve for, just in a different way than a lot of what the market's steering towards right now. So now so there's a ZTNA piece, kind of back to some of the other use cases we solve, cloud and digital. Again, it's about as applications move, you move with it, right? You're able to steer the traffic to its proper destination to keep that seamless experience for that user that we're all going for, right? We're trying to minimize disruption when we move applications and services from the data center to the cloud, or from one cloud to a multi-cloud environment, right? We just need to make sure that, you know, regardless of what that destination is, there's as little impact to the user, whether they're working in the branch, at home, or wherever as possible. So again, optimizing that delivery path to the cloud and improving the security and user experience as we can. And finally, consolidation. You know, when I get simplifying and modernizing is all about consolidation, because it leads to better business outcomes, right? Because when we can now take what we've been solving for secure access, like if we just think about our estate, and we solve secure access with things like remote access, internet gateways, include application gateways, secure web gateways, everything else, the secure branch aspect with branch firewalls and some, you know, legacy SD-WAN and things like that. We have a lot of access components, each with their own policy. Now we may have some tools to try to orchestrate some of that or stitch it together, but it's complicated, right? And it's not consistent from a policy perspective or a posture perspective. So by integrating this into a SASE platform, our outcomes are better, right? We have the ability to reduce that management, like I talked about before, by improving the people, process, and technology equation. Increase value, right? Your TCO can start to go down when you're continuously not chasing point product renewals that have their, you know, 5% uplift every year, and you have a single platform that you just have do and solve more of your use cases. This is going to give us agility, right? Instead of waiting on a provider to acquire or do something, or if the provider doesn't have a security component, then I've got to go out and find something else out and try to stitch it into this environment too. That's slow, right? It's slow and complicated. So let's get as flexible as we can, and then give that security consistency. When you've got that single data plane that's handling all of this traffic, just makes things easier on the environment. But it's not a big bang approach. So I'm talking about a lot of use cases, a lot of opportunity that's in front of us, right? But what we can do is take a practical approach to this. We solve for what we have to today, and then we let the platform grow with the other use cases as they evolve, right? Or as they are needed to be solved for. So the two key ones we see, right, at Palo Networks now every day. The first one is obvious remote worker access. That's why we're talking about it so heavily today. Then it's secure branch transformation. Some people scratch their head and say, really? And the answer is yeah, because there are so few offices at full capacity these days. Private line connectivity is no longer a good investment. So what can we reduce the cost of, and while improving operations where needed, because some of those sites still need good locations. Now there's other elements of retail and things like that where SD-WAN is still a viable option, or banks, right? So we still have brick and mortar facilities that still need to get better and more secure with their access as well. So yeah, it starts with one use case that you need to solve for, and then you let it evolve with the other use cases to where you can reach some entitlement, right? The more it's handling for you, obviously you get that down in that single policy framework, your posture is more consistent, you're simplifying management into a single interface and reducing total cost of ownership. And if the platform is robust enough, then it's also going to grow with you to solve other use cases that come forward, right? So, they're not all created equal. Obviously, there's a lot of players in the space that talk about a secure access service edge and what's next for you, but you just need to figure out what's important to you. This is what's going to help you guide your decision. It shouldn't be, oh, I fell in love with this technology, I got to make it work in my environment. No, it's what are the problems I'm trying to solve and who's best equipped to solve them for me, right? So getting down to that as few policies as possible, reducing management and orchestration overhead, integration with on-prem network security. We think about the cloud can probably solve 80 to 85% of our network security use cases. There are valid use cases that still can't be. Things like OT security, things like certain device security, data center microsegmentation. Wouldn't it make sense if you had a single user application-based policy that scaled across all of your use cases? Probably. It probably makes life a little bit easier. Private app traffic absolutely needs DLP and threat prevention in line. Doing it without it is setting yourself up for disaster, especially if you let some of these products be used for third parties or contractors where you don't support or control the endpoints. So then you're reducing your defense in depth in terms of layering. And then, really disruption. What we don't want to have is disruption when we're attaching to this, providing critical services through these clouds. How do we prevent disruption? How do we make sure that if this is a multi-tenant environment, that some customer with a big bandwidth web event or something like that isn't going to disrupt my users and knock them offline or create a service impacting incident? So go through this, figure out what's important to you, and then that'll help drive, what your SASE decision winds up being. So with that, Matt, I think that's it. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I don't know. Let's see here.
Yeah, we're pretty close to time, but folks, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, please drop them in the chat. But otherwise, I really appreciate everyone's attention today. I found this very informative, and I hope you guys did too.
Well, I think so. I think we've got appreciation for the content, not too many questions.
That's always
Maybe I did a pretty good job explaining things, I guess. I don't know.
I thought you did, so
thanks.
All right. Well, thanks, folks. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. I mean, obviously, I think I saw the announcement we're taking lunch now, but, we do have a number of other things that are happening later this afternoon. So again, appreciate everyone's time. Have a wonderful rest of your security summit.
Enjoy.